thank you for today. Thank you for this opportunity that we had to come here and learn. Thank you for the seminary and just being able to attend classes here. Thank you for using the instructors who have taken their time out and teach these classes. Lord, I pray that you work in us where we need it and grow us to be faithful to the ministry you have us to be. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. This is study 12, and it's on not lording over your flock. Did what's his name give you your? Did Robbie give you your copy
of the handout?
Of the handout? It's okay.
Sometimes we'll put stuff in the.
It's okay. I'll send you one if he didn't. You can let me know. I'll be glad to give it to you. I will not get through with this tonight, and I'm not going to pick up where I left off next semester. I'm just not going to do that. I'm on page 2. I probably got 10 and a half pages of notes, so there'll probably be 3 or 4 pages that you probably need. I appreciate it if you go back, or everybody on the video, that you go back and read it as a part of the class, just to make sure that you've read all the notes that we have. We're talking about just not lording over your flock. I have to say, this is a real fetish with me. That's the only way I know how to say it. This is one of those areas where, for me personally, I struggle with men that are abusive to their congregations. We have so many examples of those. I mentioned a couple of them, I think, last week. I forget what the guy's name was out in Washington or Oregon, wherever it was, and then the Gordon McDonald guy, and just other people that have just taken advantage. They're dictatorial, they are demanding, they intimidate. That's the last thing that you want to be doing if you are a shepherd. You influence your people by your example. You lead by example. Everybody understand that? That's a critical principle. Is that you lead by example. You don't lead by demanding. The nice part in our church about having a multiplicity of really qualified elders is that we can have discussion about anything that comes up, so that there's always a unanimity, right? There's a unity in that makes leading so much easier, because you're leading together. You're not leading as an individual. Some of these guys get in these really, really big churches. I mean, they've got thousands of members, and they have all of these satellite churches. They become the single voice almost, if I can say it that way. They've built the church. They've got it where it is, and so everybody's kind of looking to them, and they can get very out of control very quickly. And the way that we ended last week is that we said is that a leader who is a controlling leader always creates a dysfunctional church. A leader who always has to be in control is ultimately creating a very dysfunctional church. That's not good. You don't want your church to be dysfunctional. You want people to be able to talk about things. You want people to be able to disagree. You want people to be able, even I think, to challenge. I think that's a good thing, to be able to challenge decisions that you make, or I had a guy, this is kind of interesting. I had Don Pappas. You remember Don with long hair? And I gave him our church constitution and bylaws, and there was one section in there. He said I disagree with this, and so I went back and read it, and I think that he had a really good point. He's not even a member of our church. That I would go back and adjust it when we do this the board of trustees thing. But people that are controlling leaders, they find a way to control. They do it in any way. They intimidate people any way that they can. It can be through their personality and temperament. It can be through the decisions that they make. It can be through preaching. That's the worst thing that you can do, is to use the pulpit as a weapon, to use the Bible to weaponize your people. That is just terrible. I sat under a guy for 12 years that did that. And at one time I thought he was a good expositor, and I come to find out he doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. So it can be by their personality, it can be by their articulation. Some guys are much more effective in their articulation. Some people can talk better, talk faster, talk more. I'm always amazed at these guys that walk around the stage and they go back and forth from one end to the other, and I don't even think they look down. I don't even know if they have notes. They just talk the whole time. It's like, and what did you study, and where did you put that information? You can remember all of that? I think the answer to that is no. I think that comes more from, if you got a 20-minute message, maybe you can do that. If you have an hour message, I don't think you can, especially if you're in a technical place. They can do it by their education. I have 6 degrees, but I'm not going to abuse that. I'm not going to tell everybody. Well, I just did. But I'm not going to just say, hey, well, I'm the guy with the doctoral degrees. I don't want anybody calling me Dr. Fleetwood. I have students, online students. They'll write me and they'll call me Dr. Fleetwood, and I'll write them back and say, just call me Pastor Gary. I'm a lot more comfortable with that scenario. People can have a domineering leadership style, where everything has to actually funnel through them personally. That's very dangerous. I think as a pastor, especially in a small church like we have, where we don't make a lot of big decisions, that I can make decisions. Chris can make decisions. He's an elder. We can make decisions to spend money without having to go get permission to do that. If it's an $8,000, you better stop us. You're the treasurer, right? But if it's a $200, $300, $400 decision that you have to make, nobody's going to bark at that, because we trust one another to know that we had to make a good decision. So I think, in other words, the problem is that they're not willing to give people responsibility and then to just let them go do their job. If I give somebody a responsibility to do, the last thing I want to do is to give them a list of how to do that job. I want them to figure out how to do it, especially for those in our church, especially for Chris and James. I don't want to say, this is what I want you to do, this is how I want you to do it. To me, that's controlling. This is the objective. This is what we are after. This is what we want. You go take care of it, and I'll support you in that. And I think that's good leadership, because the person that's doing that work feels that they're really contributing, that they're not just a puppet on a string just doing what somebody else tells them to do. They're actually making decisions. And I think the more that they're able to make good, responsible decisions, the more creditable they become as a leader. Every leader's got to make good decisions. Every leader's got to make hard decisions at times. And you're not going to be in churches all the time, say, that have really good leadership modules in their church, that have a good model for for leadership. It's just not going to happen. It just is not going to happen. Barry, for you, if you become a pastor of a church, we talked about this for the last couple of weeks. I know you weren't here, but it's probably going to be in a small church. And a small Baptist church in a rural area does not normally have a good leadership model. They're run by families, deacons. They're run by people that have been there forever. That's nothing wrong with them being in a position of leadership, because the pastors didn't stay long enough, and somebody's got to take responsibility, and that's okay. But you have to be really careful. You've got to have a good leadership team that's carrying out their responsibilities, whatever they may be. Some guys are very assertive. They're bossy. Have you ever had somebody that was bossy? Just really overly assertive. And what they do is that they almost oppress you with their leadership style. You probably have had somebody like that. I think we've talked about that before. Where they are so assertive about, I'm the boss kind of thing. That's the last thing that you ought to tell somebody. If they don't know that you're the boss, you probably don't need to be the boss. When I worked at the Savannah Riverside, I knew who the boss was. And he never had to come to me and say, I'm the boss, you're going to do it this way. I knew how to take direction, and they would give you direction, and okay, you go figure out the details of how to get this job done on time under the budget. That's how we make money out here. So you go do that. And if I felt like I needed help in that, if the project was getting out of whack, I'd go talk to them. Every week I would get all these what do they call them, project controls, where they would tell you where you were in your project, how many hours you spent, where you were in your budget, if you were meeting your schedules, all that kind of stuff. And they were very valuable, and they got them too. So it would be stupid for me not to go to them and say, look, I know where we are. But we have we figured out what we have to do to get caught back up, to get back in on schedule, blah 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 blah. So, so if somebody is assertive and if somebody's bossy, they're not leading. That's not leadership. You cannot consider that to be leadership. They're lording over their people. They're lording over. In 1 Peter chapter 5, where all of this comes from, 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 3, it ignores being lords over those entrusted to you. That's something that God actually forbids. That's in an imperative mood verb, so it's something that God says, I do not want you to do this. I don't want you to lord over your people. I do not want you, and that includes everybody. I don't want you to lord over your staff if you're big enough to have a staff. Our church is not big enough to have a paid staff, right? I think we have a kind of a working staff, if I can call it that. But whoever God's given you to watch over, you do not want to lord over them. Just enter into the ministry and try to be the big dog, try to be the alpha dog in your church, and you will fail every time. You will fail because God doesn't want you to be the alpha dog, right? He doesn't want you to be that person. The body is a group of, we're members of one another. We have different roles, but I'm not to assert myself to the level that I'm just running over people and being bossy and oppressive. Every good servant leader, I think this is important, finds ways to affirm people under his leadership, not tear them down. He finds ways to build them up. They may need to be torn down sometimes, right? You may have people that aren't functioning the way that they need to function, but you still have to figure out ways to affirm people that are under you, under your leadership, so that I think there's a difference between affirming and controlling, right? And so you want to affirm, not control. And I cannot tell you necessarily how to do that. To me, that's kind of on-the-job training. You can't bully them. I have a book that I read. I think it's back here in the thing. It's called, I didn't use it here. It's called The Bully Pulpit. And it was a really interesting book. But by the way, there must be 15, 20 books out there called The Bully Pulpit, and or The Bully Pastor or something like that. And so you have to be careful. So a guy that's lording over, a guy that's affirming his people. How can I say this? He's not looking at what they did wrong. He's building on what they do right. You find somebody's strength, okay? Would
it be the same as encouraging?
Yeah, I think it would be. I think it would be. I mean, you want to find what they're good at, and then you want to let them be good at that. You know, everybody's not good at the same thing. In fact, you can give people responsibilities that they really don't want. You know, it's like calling on somebody at the last minute to preach for you, and they don't like preaching. They're going to be really, really nervous to do that. And so you find out what somebody's doing that's right, and then you help encourage them to keep doing it. I'm about to burn slap up in here. Am I the only one? Huh? I'm the only one. It's okay. I will defer. I'm not going to bully. I'm not going to bully. So you just have to be a little careful there. And let's just say that somebody does something that's wrong and something that you don't like, right? You don't want to play the blame game. You do not want to play the blame game where you are going to blame them. Well, brother, you shouldn't have done it that way. I remember one time we had something that happened at our church that was unfortunate, but it worked out good. It really worked out good. We had a guy that was, it would have been better off if he hadn't been to our church, and one of the guys that was helping me, that was sort of an associate pastor at the time, he felt like this guy was very distracting in the service. He'd kind of be laughing, and the brother would be teaching or something, and the guy would be kind of talking with his son or something like that. And so one Sunday morning, he pulled him into my office. He said, "Can I talk to y'all for just a minute?" So he pulled him into the office. I'm sure y'all probably know who I'm talking about, but I won't mention any names here. He pulled him into the office and said he really would like for them to stop that. Next thing I know, the guy goes flying out the door. He's flying out the door, he's grumbling under his breath, and he walks out the door and he said, "I'll never come back to this church," or something like that, you know. So this young staff person who just came down on the weekends from school, and he, a really sweet brother. We had a long talk that afternoon, and he went back and apologized and asked the guy to forgive him, and the guy never said that he would. Or never back up, he didn't say it that way. The guy said, "I will forgive you, but I will never forget." Yeah, I mean, that's just worthless as far as I'm concerned. So, and he never came back to the church, which was a good thing for my church, because he was very, very arrogant in his approach to people, things, and me, especially. So, I think, here's what I think. You may disagree with me, so just adjust it. I think when your staff fails, or your leadership team fails, that you want to be the upfront guy that kind of takes responsibility for it. You may not be the one that actually failed, but you want to be out in front of them, right? Does that make sense? See, is that the way it worked in the law, law enforcement?
Right, yeah, we would have, if somebody did something stupid, their supervisor would be like, okay, we got a problem, but I'm gonna keep things from being unfair, but we have to deal with this.
Right.
But, okay, you know, he would, all right, I'll handle it. You know, the lieutenant would he would take care of it and filter what came down to whatever degree he
Right.
could. But it's like, well, I was supervisor that day, it's on me to a degree. But we'll handle it and it won't happen again.
Right. But that's good leadership. That's good leadership when you're not passing the buck, or let me back up, where you're protecting your team. If they continue to do it, if it's a long-term thing, where they are always, where they're always making mistakes, then you have to deal with it.
Yeah, well, I've heard it put, you can delegate authority, but not responsibility.
Right. That's a good way to put it. But I think if your leadership team fails, if you're the leader in a church, if you're the pastor and they expect you to lead, that you want to take responsibility for that. He's as much a part of the team as they are, and he takes responsibility for what may be happening in the church. I want you to think of leadership. I think this is the right way to say it. If you take notes, this is something to write down. I think that leadership is coaching. It's coaching. A coach coaches, but he's not actually in the game, right? He's not actually playing in the game. He's got other people that are playing in the game, and he's coaching, and he's making some big decisions, but they got to pass the ball, they got to hit the ball, they got to catch the ball, whatever it may be. They got to tackle, they got to make the double play. They've got to do all of that. I think it would be impossible to have a good team of any kind I think I got it wrong in my notes. Let me write it. It would be almost impossible to have a good team of any kind without a really good coach, right? But the coach is still going to give direction, but he's going to let his members play the game. And I think it's true in a church. I've always heard it said that you want to become the kind of leader that you would really love to follow yourself. You know, what kind of leader do you want to play under? What kind of leader do you want to serve under? What kind of leader do you want to work under? I had upper level managers where I worked for about 15 years. Some of them were really, really, really good. They were really, really good. I enjoyed working for them. I'd have done whatever. I'd just jump over hoops and turn backflips for them, and I can't turn backflips. And then there were other leaders that I had, managers that I had that were just oppressive almost. They wouldn't leave you alone. They just wouldn't let you do your job. They felt that they could not let anybody fail. And maybe in that environment, maybe there's some reality to that. In a church, that's not true. Why is that not true? Somebody tell me. The members of my church ought to know. Well, probably, maybe don't. It's because you learn more through your failure than you do through your success. Now, you've heard me say that 1,000 times. So, you learn more through your failure than you do through your success. So one author that I read, he said, and I think it's so true, that as a leader, you are exponentially better as a strong, well-functioning team. You're exponentially better as a strong, functioning team. And I think that is so accurate. A team can do a lot more than an individual can do, right? A team can do much more. Even a small team, if you take something like golf, if you watch any of the professional golfers, they all of them have a caddy. There's nobody out there without a caddy. The caddy carries the bag, the caddy has the markers, the caddy knows the distances, he's looking at the wind, he's looking at everything that is going on. He's telling the guy, he says, I think that's too much. Maybe you need to go to a 5-iron rather than a 6-iron, or whatever it may be. He's helping the guy make adjustments. Listen, there's a ridge on the back. If you go over, you can put some spin on it, the ball will come back, blah, 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 blah. They work together as a team. I've actually heard, sometimes if I was watching it on TV, I've heard the caddy talk, because they'll have the microphone so you can hear what's going on. You can hear the caddy actually talk the golfer, the PGA golfer, out of the club that he was going to use. You know, no, normally the player is going to use the club he's comfortable with, but a good caddy is going to speak his mind. And the golfer is not going to be mad at him, because he knows that they are a team. If I go to church and I make a decision, and Chris hears about my decision and he doesn't think it's a good decision, I'm going to listen to what he has to say, because we're on the same team. Are you ladies cold already? Are you men cold? Comfortable now? So you can do, any team can do more than an individual can do. And you always want the members of your team to be thinking. That's a really, really important part to me. I want their ideas are just as valuable as mine. How do we solve this problem? We have this problem in the church. We need to get this done. How do we get it done? What are the resources we have? I want them to be creative. I want them not be afraid to take some risk. I think if your church is going to be successful, you have to take some risk. There are a lot of churches that don't want to take any kind of risk at all. They don't want to spend any money. They want to keep everything in the bank. They don't want to make an investment into other people. They are concerned that they won't have enough money if something goes wrong. There's just 1,000 different reasons why they don't want to take risk. But I want the guys in my church, especially the leaders in my church, which I would say would be the elders and the associate pastor, I want them to be a think tank. A think tank. I like that word. Everybody understand what that word is? What a think tank is. We did that all the time where I used to work. We'd go into a room and we'd bring a bunch of the team members into the room, and we would just come up. We would sort of throw ideas out on the table. No idea was a bad idea. Every idea we wanted to evaluate, see what credit it had, all that kind of stuff. But you want people thinking about how you can make your church more effective in its mission. Now, I want to say something here. If you were to ask me, where in the scriptures does God talk the most in the New Testament? Where does God talk the most about bad leaders? It's in Matthew chapter 23, right? Matthew chapter 23 is that chapter where Jesus has a list of, I think it's 7 or 8 woes that he gives to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And I would say that Jesus spent, I don't want to say an inordinate amount of time, but Jesus spent a good amount of his time, because he was forced to to actually refuting and rebuking the spiritual abuse that other people were, of how they were handling the Word of God, the temple, the offerings, all that kind of stuff. In fact, here in Matthew 23, at the end of it, the woes that he pronounces on the spiritual leaders of his day is really frightening. You don't want God to talk to you like this. I mean, if you go back and you read it, you do not want God talking to you like this on the day that you finally stand before him as a leader. These men, here's their problem. Everybody listen carefully. They were the most educated men in their culture. Right? Everybody understand that? They were the most educated men. If I can say it in our terms, they were the ones that had gone to the seminary the longest. And you have to understand that under the Jewish religion, that the church basically was the government, if I can say it that way. They were under Roman rule, but still in the Jewish community, the church was the government, and these men were the ones that they had the Bible, they had the scrolls, they did the teaching, everybody listened to them. And to make it worse, not only were they the most educated, but they were also the richest. So I'm not sure that's a really good combination all the time. The people that are sort of the best trained to have the most money. That's how you get power, that's how you get control over people. And so here are men who were the spiritual elite, and Jesus called them, I have a list I wrote here. This is what he called them: blind guides, fools, hypocrites, serpents, and a brood of vipers. Blind guides, fools, hypocrites, serpents, and a brood of vipers. Those are not nice names, right? I don't want anybody to call me a blind guy, a fool, a hypocrite, a serpent, or a brood of vipers, and I surely don't want God to call me that. But he did. I want you just to read there in 23:4. It says, this is one thing that Jesus said about them. He said, "For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." So they're making demands of other people that they're not willing to help. You can't work on Sunday, but if the ox gets into the ditch, right? The scriptures gave them plenty or the Sabbath gave them plenty of leeway to go get the ox out of the ditch. Jesus talked to him and rebuked him when he healed some. He would always. It was always uncanny to me that Jesus had a way of healing people on the Sabbath, right? I think that was intentional, if I can say it that way. It kind of provoked these guys to just hate him even more. So it's important to give the idea of lording over an additional name that was that I mentioned in the beginning last week. I want to call it spiritual abuse, right? I want you to think of lording over as spiritually abusing people. Spiritually abusing your role, spiritually abusing maybe the authority and the power that's been delegated to you by other people. I would say that if I were making a word picture out of this, that pastoral abuse is the same as what we might consider to be spiritual abuse in a family, where the husband is abusing his wife mentally, emotionally, physically. He's abusing the children. Beating them and yelling at them and screaming and just abusing his family. That's what spiritual abuse is in the church. I think you ought to see it that way, because I don't have any mercy for a father or a husband that's abusing his wife and abusing his children. I'm just not very merciful at that point. I don't think that you are. And I don't think it's any different. So it's treating people with disrespect, It's treating people with disregard, and both of which are terribly insulting and hurtful to the other person. You can't just put people down. If I can say it a different way, when something happens, you can't just put somebody in their place. You know what I'm saying? You can't just, if they're kind of messing up in your church, you can't just go to them and put them down and put them in their place. You can't lord over them. You got to go find a way to help them. You can't just be demeaning to them. It's not always easy. I would say that that's certainly not an easy task, but I think if something like that were necessary, you have to communicate in a gracious way. You have to communicate in a very kind way. You have to be careful that you just don't abuse the role that you have in that team. And I would say that you are much better off is that if you involve your leadership team to do that you don't go alone. At least be two of you to go if you had to talk to somebody about something that was kind of serious. Just so that you'd have more insight, you'd have more wisdom about how to work through something, how to help somebody. I think the point is simple. Anyone that's in leadership can become spiritually abusive in so many different ways. I want to give you 4 obvious and recognizable ways that you can determine if spiritual abuse is happening in your church with your leadership team, okay? You ought to write each one of these down. I've already mentioned some of them. I think that there are others. I got a call after, but I'm just talking about these primarily are dealing just with the pastor. Okay, but I got a call last week. It was kind of an interesting call about how somebody on a leadership team, not the pastor, but how somebody on a leadership team was demeaning certain individuals in the church. And they wanted to know what to do about it and what to do with it. It was an interesting call. It really was. But I want to give you these 4. I've already mentioned a couple of them, but I want to emphasize them again. The first one is that he can be spiritually abusive through his strong, overbearing personality. Now, I think that this, of all the ones that I'm going to mention, is the one that you have to be the most careful with. Because there are people that have really, really strong personalities. If you've, I won't mention any kind of national pastors that we would all know, but there's some that just come to my mind. Charles Stanley just died recently, and he was a sweet brother. I mean, he really was. If you listen to his messages, we still listen to him on Sunday morning while we're eating breakfast, and he has 2 messages every Sunday. And he was never aggressive, he was never overbearing, he was never, he was always just gentle in the way that he taught, and I think that his ministry was that way. But there was a time in his church where he had some other people on his leadership team that didn't like him. I don't know if you know the history about it. And they wanted to push him out of the church. And he fought against them. He fought against them very heavily. I mean, it was a fight, if I can say it that way. And he won. He won, and I think one of the reasons that he won is because he didn't have this overbearing personality. I don't think he could be overbearing. I mean, just from everything that I know about him, I think he was gentle, he was gracious, he was kind. You know, he and his wife got a divorce. I think she had some real issues, and he tried to go do everything he could to save their marriage and go to counseling, and she wouldn't do it. And, you know, it's just stuff. And he was going to resign, and his church would not let him resign because they loved him that much. They knew it wasn't his fault. They knew that basically it wasn't something that he had necessarily created. They understood the problem that he actually had. So I know one individual who's a very large individual compared to me. He's a very, very large. He's a big person. He's a huge person actually, but he's not only big physically, but he has a big personality. I'm just talking about a really, really big personality. And so, unfortunately, his big personality is so strong that he feels compelled that he has to lead. And that he can do it without a lot of input. He may not tell you that, but I think the bottom line of his ministry is that he has to be out front. He feels like he has to lead. He has to be compelling, almost to the point, because he's such a big person with a big personality that has really big ideas, right? He feels compelled that he has to push all of that, and he uses his personality, his kind of overwhelming voice and style to be able to push people in a certain direction. I've been with him on several occasions when his personality, his big personality, literally overrode his good judgment. It just simply overrode his good judgment. He did not exercise good judgment because his personality got in the way. And even if somebody was there talking to him about, I don't think this is a good decision, hey, we're a team here, he would keep pushing until he got his way. I watched him make these bad decisions, and then he would use his strong personality to kind of camouflage the real issue, which was his own personal incompetence to make good decisions. You've been around people that have really strong personalities, and they don't want to be wrong. They don't want you to think that they're wrong. They want to be right, and they're going to figure out a way to get what they want. In essence, he was never a team player. Right? Understand what I'm just saying? He was never a team player. And in what you might call a kind of critical situation, he was always imposing his will on whatever team he was leading. Number two, this person in leadership can be spiritually abusive through the articulation and the tone of his voice. Some pastors are so gifted when it comes to speaking, and they know how to capture the attention of their audience very easily. If you go out and you listen to some of the TV personalities, it's worth it to me. It's worth it to me to go listen to them. Listen, just take 20 minutes and you can listen to part of a message that they're doing. Go type in who they are, you know. I won't mention any names, but you can just go type them in. And you know from the very beginning that they have strong, they are good speakers. Most of them could be what's the right term? Somebody help me. They could work in any corporation as motivational speakers. They could be a motivational speaker in IBM, in anything. Good morning. I mean, good evening. So,
We understand.
you know, they could be They could be a motivational speaker and anywhere. They have the personality, they have the smile, they have the articulation, they have the words, they are smart. They're able to put all of that together and become an influence on the people that they are actually working with. But the problem with that, I think, is very simple. It seems that that much too often, the more captivating that someone becomes, the more convincing they become, and the more convincing they become, the more controlling they become. Everybody understand what I just said? The more convincing you become, the more control you're going to want. Now, if I'm a pastor, if I'm teaching, I have a goal. I'm trying to teach you I'm teaching to persuade, right? Why not? I mean, that's every good teacher ought to teach to persuade. But if somebody comes to me and shares with me something that's wrong or something that's out of balance, I've got to be smart enough to say, yep, you're right, and go back and change that. I'd rather be persuasive on doing the right thing rather than just kind of holding on to something that I've developed, some idea, some teaching that I've given. That's not true for everybody, but it has been true for a large number of people in ministry that were very captivating. And because they were very captivating, they ultimately became very controlling. Y'all,
Manipulative.
huh?
Manipulative.
They manipulated. Now, I've given you one example. I'm not going to mention the name of a pastor here in South Carolina who was that way. He had a very large church. They would. One of the things that made them different, they made the national kind of news as far as churches were concerned about how many people they would baptize on a weekend. They would baptize sometimes, certainly not every weekend, but they would have a baptism service out in the parking lot of their church. It's a very large church. I'll get to that. And they would baptize anywhere from 600 to 800 people. Now, I don't know, God help me if I'm wrong. I'm not sure that. I saw 3,000 people get saved in the book of Acts, and I saw the church was growing kind of exponentially in the beginning, but after that it slowed down. I've seen some really remarkable pictures of revival in Uganda. Uganda has the richest evangelist in the world, and that may be one of the reasons. I think the casualty list is very long. This pastor was a pastor that led his church into a $40 million debt. Okay, you got to follow me on this. There's not one church that I know of that should go into a $40 million debt. I had a pastor that led his church into almost an $8 million debt, and he died about 2 years later. Right? And the person that came in inherited that debt. And the people didn't like him as much as they liked the other people. Right? And the guy that was probably going to be the largest contributor to that debt didn't like him either and left the church. And so the church is just hanging there with this huge, humongous debt. I didn't even know if they paid it off yet. This is years ago. And so, but this guy was very controlling. He was very convincing. He had great articulation. And my question is, why would any church want to spend $40 million in a relatively small town, say the size of Aiken, where I live, spend $40 million on itself. Why would any church want to do that? I don't have one good reason other than there's some ego issue here. And to me, it's just, it's ludicrous. And I cannot imagine the Spirit of God guiding a church to do that. So you know what happened. You may know the person I'm talking about, but just don't mention the name. The guy was having marriage problems. He was having drinking problems. He ultimately got a divorce. And then you know what he did, right? He left the church. He left the church, sitting there with a $40 million debt, and he went and started another church. How? What's a bad word? I mean, how ridiculous is that? How ridiculous is that? He called the next church that he went to, they called it Second Chance Church, something like that. You know, give me a second chance, and I'll take you into debt. I'll take you into $40 million worth of debt. I'd hate to be on the board of trustees of that. Number 3, he can be spiritually abusive through his actions and his body language. I had a pastor once who, when he was preaching, everybody look up here for a minute. I'll get on somebody. He'd be preaching and he'd just look at you. And he'd turn away, he'd stop looking at James, and he'd turn over and look at Barry. He'd make a point, and he'd look at Chris. You know, he'd look over at Tracy. Huh? I mean, it was intimidating, right? I think you ought to look at your people when you're teaching them, but I don't think you ought to give them the old bug eye, stare it down, I'm talking to you, kind of thing. And it hurt people. It intimidated people. It was his personality and his tone and all of that. It was his way of intimidating his audience as if he was the authority in the room, and he wasn't. He was the elephant in the room, right? He was the elephant in the room that nobody wanted to talk about. Nobody wanted to address the issues that he actually created. So if you ever become an intimidating pastor, you need to leave the ministry and just go find another group of people that you can intimidate, but don't intimidate God's people. Don't even consider intimidating the people of God. If you intimidate your people, I want to say it this way, I want to say it in a strong way. If you intimidate your people, you do not love your people. You do not love your people. If you demean your people, you do not love them. You're simply in love with yourself. Number 4, he can be spiritually abusive through his using the pulpit as the place where he tries to gain control. That's a no-no. I'm just telling you, that is a no-no. I think you have an advantage, okay, and I want to say it in a positive way. I think as a pastor you have an advantage because you are behind the pulpit. And you ought to use it, not to your advantage, but you ought to use it to God's advantage. That you're a good teacher, you're a sound teacher, you're a good expositor, you can field the questions properly, you can do so without intimidating your people. But the pulpit is not a place where you try to gain control. I think many men think that what they cannot get accomplished apart from the pulpit, they can get accomplished from behind the pulpit. Like they're trying to raise money for something. maybe they had a deacons meeting, and there wasn't really a lot of unity about it. And they can get behind the pulpit with the people there when the deacons aren't there, and that's a no-no. If you have a leadership team and that's what you operate under, you need to stay under that umbrella. That's sort of your protection. Once you get out of that and you start to control and to get things done apart from your leadership team, I think you're destined to failure. I think this is an abusive pastor to me. Thinks that he can be overbearing, domineering, bossy, demanding, arrogant in his teaching. He can, he's authoritative about everything. It's almost like he's threatening the people that he's been called on to serve. You cannot threaten your people. You have to give them the freedom to fail. You have to let them fail. So that you can be there as a servant to help them. But the pulpit is a privilege that God has given to you. When you teach, whether it's in a small church or a big church, or a lot of times when I go to Romania, I'm always asked to go and speak somewhere else on a Sunday morning. To go to a church and to speak at that church, and then always on Sunday night. Sunday nights they're a bigger service. I'm not sure why that is. And go and speak in the Sunday morning and the Sunday evening services at different churches, and I can't just walk in there and just use the pulpit as some kind of weapon, because I don't think that they're really doing what God wants them to do. I can't do that. I'm forbidden to do that. They're not my people to begin with. And so, no pastor is the authority of his church, right?
Right.
No pastor is the authority of his church. Jesus Christ is the Lord of his church. Not me, not you, not even the ministry team that you are functioning with. We may have to exercise responsibility, but I am not the authority, nor do I want to be the authority. I want to be a servant leader, right? That's the term that we've used. And if you're not careful, you may quickly find yourself supplanting and usurping the authority of Christ. That's a really, really bad thing. Usurping his authority in his church. This is his church, right? I always have I know it's going to sound kind of crazy, because I've been pastor in Chinbell for 28 years, and sometimes I'll call it my church, and I'm thinking, it's really not my church. It's God's church. It's a church God's allowed me to pastor. And so if you stand in the pulpit week after week after week and you teach others, then you have to understand that according to James chapter 3 and verse 1, is that you have a stricter judgment. God's going to address you personally when you stand before him in a different way than he does somebody else in your church. I think I almost have a double stricter judgment. Why? Because I teach at church and I teach here. All right, where I can abuse this, and if you're going to be a teacher, you stand under a stronger judgment. You'll be judged more severely. I cannot tell you what that means, and I can tell you this: I do not want to find out. I'll read the verse to you, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. I'll just leave it at that and let it say what it says. Pastoring is not some kind of spiritual game that we can play with God as if there are no consequences for our actions. So let's think of it this way. Let's think of it this way. If you are, and I hope that you believe that you are, if you're here in the seminary for a certain purpose, if you believe that you are a divinely called shepherd in God's church, that is as serious of a calling as a man can have on his life. But because of that calling, it carries with it what I want to call divine responsibilities. And you cannot, what's the right term? You cannot divorce yourself from those responsibilities, whatever they may be. All right, I'm not going to give you a list of what I would think that they would be. But you have divine responsibilities. If we were to make a small list, we would say it would be things like, you are responsible to study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needs not to be ashamed. Somebody that rightly divides the word of God, right? We would say that you can't lord over your flock. You know, we could just go through 1 Timothy and Titus and 2 Timothy and just come up with an entire list of responsibilities that God has given to you. So, in light of the seriousness of this idea of lording over, what we see immediately in 1 Peter 5:3, everybody turn back to 1 Peter 5:3. I want you to see this. I'm big on this, so I know that those that go to my church understand this. In 1 Peter 5:3, I'm really big on the word but. B-U-T. And so Peter is saying here, you cannot be lords over those that God has entrusted to you, but this is the contrasting conjunction here, but being examples to the flock. And if you are an example and not a lord, when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that does not fade away. So just because somebody's a shepherd doesn't mean, or a pastor of a church, doesn't mean they're going to get this crown. The guys that are going to get this crown are those that are examples to their flock and do not lord over their flock. So this is a contrast between lording over your people or being an example to them. And that little word but is a word that you have to handle properly. I mean, you have to handle it. It's so important to handling this passage in the right way. In essence, this is what it says. This is what it says. Let me put it this way. It says, one of these you cannot do, and the other you must do, right? You cannot lord, you must be an example. You cannot do this, you must do this. You cannot lord over my people, you must be an example to them. So, this is not optional. There's no options here. There's no get out of jail free card for this. If you're going to shepherd your flock, if you're going to be an elder and a pastor in a church, you have to be an example. You have to be an example in every way possible. Some pastors are not examples. All they are teachers, right? They have not really taught their people how to live by example. They may be good teachers, but you just never see them in real life. You never see them really interacting with people in their church or doing things in their church. Some churches are so big that the pastor doesn't even know who the people are. I had a couple in my church that, they go to our church and they had gone to a church in Augusta, they went to a large church in Aiken, and after a couple years, they just felt like they just were not being fed and had nice music and all that kind of stuff. But I'll never forget something that the wife told me one time. We were talking about it, I was just asking them about it, why they decided to come to our church and or even come and stay. But she said, well, this is really kind of interesting that you asked that. She said, and she was serious, she said, we sit on about the second or third row at the church that they went to. And she said, if we were in a restaurant and we were ordering our food and the pastor of our church came and sat down in the table beside us, he wouldn't know who we were. He's never even spoken to us. We don't even know his name. We wouldn't know he wouldn't know us. We'd have to introduce, hey, we are, and we go to your church. Oh, nice to meet you. We have another couple that has come, was going to another church recently, and they had contacted me about our Awana program. And at the time we didn't have one, and so I told them, and I wrote them a long letter and gave them all the churches that had Awana programs that I knew about. They didn't know any other churches. I gave them where the church was located, the address and all that time, the time when they had Awana. And they really appreciated that. I said, we just ought to go to those churches and just, you can check them out on Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, whenever, and everything. And I didn't hear from them for about 6 months. And then they called me up, and started asking us some questions. They said, we've been listening to your messages on your Facebook page, or not Facebook, but our website, whatever it was. And this was really interesting. They said, I told them, I said, look, they were asking me all kinds of questions about the church and the ministry of the church and what the messages, what kind of series I would do and all that kind of stuff. And I said, well, why don't we just come over to your house one night? My wife and I will come over. And she said, well, why don't y'all come over and we'll eat? We'll just have a meal. It was a nice time. It was a really nice time. I said, well, that'd be great. I said, we'd love to do that, but you don't have to. So we'd be glad to come without eating. And she said, no, y'all come over. So she made a nice meal. We came over and we sat around for about 3 hours talking about our church. And I asked the question. I said, this is the question I asked. I said, in fact, their first service, Jane, was to your ordination service. Which was kind of neat. Because they said, well, we're going to come to your church in 2 weeks. I said, well, James is going to be ordained that Sunday and all that. And they came and they really enjoyed that. And I didn't, I think I gave an ordination thing and Scott did. But I asked the question, I asked them where they were going to church at that time. And they said they had been going to a Presbyterian church. A large Presbyterian church, I think the one probably out on the bypass, I forget what the name of it is, doesn't matter. And I asked him, and she said, we had questions, we had a lot of questions that we wanted to ask the pastor, and so we contacted him, and I don't know how she contacted him, and we wanted to know if we could if he would be willing to come and meet with them so that he could share some questions they had to ask about the church. And I don't know what the questions were. And I didn't ask. And she said it had been 4 months and they hadn't heard the first word from that pastor. He got people visiting his church. They called, would you please come see us? We'd like to talk to you about joining your church. And but we have some questions, and he never ever contacted them. And I mean, to me, you've got to be an example, right? I mean, you can't just ignore your people. You cannot just ignore them when they have questions, when there's something that's going on in their life that's difficult, whenever they need some answers to some questions. None of this is optional for us. You have to be an example. The size of the church has no bearing on this. Doesn't matter if you got 10 members or 10,000 members. Hopefully you don't ever have a church that has 10,000 members. And hopefully you don't have a church that ever has 10. But you cannot, this is not something where the size of the church has any bearing on this. There's no size of the church mentioned here where this is a bigger church, I got to take a bigger leadership role, I got to keep everything going. No, you cannot lord over your church. You have to be an example, whether you're a big church or a small church. And I think somebody like Charles Stanley people loved him because he was a gentle leader in his church. Charles was not, Dr. Stanley was not somebody that gave you really deep, detailed expositional messages. He just doesn't do that, or he never did do that. Doesn't matter the degree of your education, doesn't have any bearing on this. When you read 1 Peter 5:3, there are no added provisions or stipulations for why you as a spiritual leader in your church do not have to obey this. These words are not optional. This is called ministry non-negotiables. This is non-negotiable. This is non-negotiable for anybody that's in the ministry. You cannot rationalize them away. You cannot just say, "Well, I don't have to obey this." Yes, you do. Yes, you do. This is one of those really serious things. Peter's talking about shepherding the flock, and so I think the intention of these words here is to create in anybody that's going to be a spiritual leader a certain amount. A certain mindset that is to govern everything that they're supposed to do, right? You have to have a mindset. You have to get up in the morning and you have a mindset about who you are and what your role is and how you can administer that role in your church. And that mindset has to be, I cannot lord over my flock. I hope in the 28 years that I've been there that my church has never felt that way. Y'all been there for 26, 27, something like that. Yeah, close to it, 27. That I've never tried to just run the church. Just never tried to do that. Don't want to do that. Y'all been 27 of it.
Well, I've been there longer than that, but since you've been there.
Yeah. Oh, you were there before I was?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's even better. That's even better. You're the matriarch here. So,
Christy was one of our kids.
Yeah, Christy was.
say that again.
Christy went to Sunday school and when she was little there. Amy
Oh, I
Young.
forgot that.
Amy Young was her teacher.
Yeah, I remember that. They met in that little room there beside my office, I think. So the two words for being, this is interesting. I want you to look there in verse 3. James, you'd appreciate this with all the word studies that you do. this is really interesting to me. It says, in fact, do you have your,
I can pull it up.
yeah, how it reads in the New American Standard?
Oh, yeah, in the New American Standard? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've got how it reads in there, but I want to.
It says, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock.
So it doesn't even use the word being, right?
No. Proving to be examples to the flock.
Okay. So that's a much better translation than what I'm reading from in the King James.
Okay.
Because the King James says, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And so what doesn't come out in the English, if you read that, everybody's just freezing in here. What, you got 2 blankets. What really stands out to me is that the 2 words for being are both imperative participles, right? If you see the letters ing on the end of a verb, like carrying or pushing
Or lording.
or lording, that makes it basically a participle, a verbal participle, all right? But these are both imperative verbal participles, and both of the 2 primary verbs of not being lords and of being examples, they are in the second person plural. Now that's very interesting to me, that they're in the second person plural. I, you, he, she, it, we, you, right? The second person plural, because they are directly addressing the elders in verse 1. And that's why they call them being lords, plural, and being examples, plural, because he's addressing a plurality of the membership. Verse 1 says, the elders who among you exhort, I who am a fellow elder. I'm just one of the elders in this church. But what's not readily noticeable in the New King James Version is that both of these 2 words translated as being are 2 different words in the Greek text. And so it comes out in the New American Standard. And I knew that it did. The first word for being is part of the verb kato kairio. I'm not going to spell it. You can look it up. We studied that at the beginning, and it carries the idea of having to control everything and finding it necessary to try and subjugate others to your control. All right? But the second word, that's the first word. The second word, being, is actually a separate word. It's genomai. And genomai means to come into existence or to come into any state. Now that's a really difficult. Boy, when I got here in the study, I was doing everything that I could do to figure out what all of that meant. I could understand that there are 2 different words. I could understand that the first word being lords, which is kind of one word, it carries the idea of having to control everything. But when I come to the second word, genomai, of being an example, being examples, it means to bring something into existence or to bring something into any state. So even though they're translated the same in English, in the Greek language, in the New American Standard, and probably the ESV and the others, they have very far-reaching differences, all right? They're very far-reaching differences. You have to bring this out. To me, this is one of those things that you have to, when you're studying, you have to find it out. So the New American Standard says, nor yet as lording it over, though it doesn't use the word being, allotted to your charge, but proving.
Approving to be
Okay,
examples.
so proving to be examples is much different than being examples. You've got to prove yourself as an example. And what that does is it brings out the idea that you have to bring something into being. You have to create something. You have to bring it into, if I took the definition of it, you have to bring it into existence. You have to prove yourself. Right? That's the problem with a resume. The resume doesn't prove anything.
You gotta bring something to the table.
You got to bring something to the table, but you've got to keep bringing something to the table. Right? You can't bring a piece of paper to the table
Gotta live up to it.
that says that you are actually an example. You have to prove yourself. You have to be an example. You have to bring that into existence. You have to become an example. You can't just say, I have a master's degree or I have a doctorate degree, so I'm qualified. You may not be qualified at all, whether you have a degree or not. You have to prove yourself to be an example. If you just take a resume and hand it to somebody, they don't have an idea who you are. They don't know what you're like. All they know is how many churches you've been to, right? Which is probably sometimes not a good thing. They don't know what your character is like. They don't know if you're faithful. They don't know if you study. You can preach a really great sermon. You can take your best sermon. James, you would take yours on love, whatever it's called.
Agape love.
Yeah, agape love. And you could preach it 1,000 times, you know, and you got it down pat, and it could just be. But then the next week, if you hadn't studied, just fall flat on your face.
Mhm.
So you have to prove yourself to your people. And honestly, if you don't believe me at this, then you probably need to get another job. This takes years. This takes years. This takes years. How long have you been in your church? 8 years? 7, 8 years?
6.
6? So all of your kids have grown up here, right? They've all been born here. How old is Katie? How old is your wife? She's
30.
Yeah, come on.
31.
31. You gotta just.
Well, she didn't grow. We came here around 2017.
I'm just-
came here.
I'm just kidding.
So neither one of us grew up in this church. We kind of showed we knew somebody who came here, and that's how we landed here.
Yeah. But you've been here. Your kids have grown up in this church. Everybody knows you, right? They know your character. They know what your family's like. They know whether or not you love your wife. They know whether or not you're faithful. They know whether or not you can handle a ministry class. Or I've been here with you during Vacation Bible School, and just the way you related to people. It's really good. People get to see that you've proven yourself to be an example, right? Chris, you've been in our church for 28 years, probably.
26.
26, but not as a believer the whole time. And James, you've been in our church, what, 2 years, 2.5, something like that?
Well, it's been 4 years since we've been in China. So,
Oh, okay, 4 years. No, wow,
it's been about 3 years. I
Oh,
think
okay,
we've been
good,
in China.
good,
Oh,
good. Good. Time really flies when you're 75. It just flies away. So I didn't realize it'd been that long. But,
It does at every age.
but I think
I said it flies at every age.
yeah, and I think we've been doing our Bible study on a Saturday morning for about 2.5 years. So, we didn't start that immediately.
Right.
So, but there's, in other words, you have to bring all of this into existence in your church, and that's not something that you can do in 2 weeks. You have to prove yourself to be an example. You know, I would work on that. If you got a church, let's say either one of you men got a church, or any of you 3 men got a church, that you would have to prove yourself. If you already go to a church like Chris, like you've been at our church for a long time, everybody knows you. 3 years doesn't take us, we learn a lot in 3 years, 4 years, whatever it's been, about you. But you still got to be an example. You got to be faithful, right? You have to be faithful. You have to have a great relationship with your wife. You all the things that we've been studying about. You can't be lording over people. You've got to have a servant's heart. You've got to, all the things that we've talked about in these last 2 semesters. It takes years, and I think it takes a lot of different experiences for a pastor to prove himself to be a worthy example to follow. I don't think there's anything especially easy about this. And the reason I don't think it's easy is because, and I think this is the right way to say it, is because people are never really going to know how you're going to respond until you are actually confronted with a very difficult circumstance, right? You've got to have that confrontation. It's got to take place.
You gotta see you under stress.
That's right. That's right. You got to see how you're going to operate, how you're going to treat people, how you're going to talk to them, how you're going to manage that, whatever it may be. And that doesn't just come up every week. It just doesn't happen every week, but it will happen, especially if you come in as a young pastor and you want to do something differently and you feel really strongly about it than say the leadership team that you have, we'll just call them deacons at this point and make it easy, and they don't agree with you. How are you going to deal with that? Well, I think you're going to have to defer a lot of times. I think you're going to have to defer. I don't know if compromise is the right word, but I think you're going to have to defer so that you can develop. You still need more time to develop. My church, I can't remember the last time that my church just challenged my leadership. I just can't remember. But I hope I don't give them a time that they need to, you know. And I think they would support me if there was a very confrontational person or a very confrontational family that came into the church, that we would want to handle it properly, and hopefully we would find a way to do that. We don't have many people, so we don't have a lot of that.
It'd be dealt with as a team.
Huh?
It'd be dealt with as a team.
I think it would be. I think that's the only way we would want to deal with it. I don't want to be out there. I don't want to be an island, a man on an island here. I don't want to be. But I made a list, a small list. There are relational issues. Some people in your church are not going to like you. Remember I told you last week that, I think it was last week, that when you become a pastor, somebody's voted on you. But not everybody has voted for you, probably. Some people like the other pastor and you don't fit the bill. They wanted a pastor with hair. You know what I'm saying? Or they didn't want a pastor that was this young. They wanted a pastor that was like this. Whatever it may be. There are going to be relational situations. There are going to be doctrinal issues that will come up. I remember that Henry never really enjoyed me talking about
Election.
well, I'll call it Reformed theology. He just didn't like me talking about that. He thought I was wrong or something. And we worked through it. But there are other members of our church that don't fully buy into that. And I'm not pressing it on them, right? I'm not pressing the issue. There are things about Reformed theology that I don't agree with, or the non-Reformed. I don't, you know, it's just like we're all doing the same thing, let's figure out a way to get done what God wants us to do, rather than argue over some little nuance of scripture. There can be marital situations. If you've listened throughout this study, I know that Alex and Rachel have, because they talked to me about it, about all of the statistics that I've read you about how the ministry can damage a marriage. Just damage a marriage, damage your children. You know, it's it can be very, very damaging. And if you don't listen to the statistics, you're just not smart. You're just not smart.
Gary, question for you. You know how the New American Standard puts, but proving to be examples, and you said the King James says, but being an example. Proving, would you say what Paul is trying, or Peter is trying to say here is that we just need to consistently or progressively continue to be an example through several situations or all situations? It's just a progressively, continuously thing, because I know it's in the present tense.
I think it has to be that.
Yeah.
I think you have to constantly, if you probably went to the Amplified Bible, it may even bring that aspect of that out.
I can pull that up. Actually, I have that translation.
You can read that for us.
All right.
Yeah, you gotta walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
That's right. And talking is easy. I can prove that too.
It's, yeah, the Amplified says, not domineering as arrogant dictatorial and overbearing persons over those in your charge, but being examples, patterns, and models of Christian living to the flock, the congregation.
So it doesn't really, the word being, is if it's in the present tense, it's a present imperative in mind, and it's a participle. So what they call it, James, is that they call it
It's like
they call it, it's a verb with the imperative sense.
Yeah.
That's the term, and that's the term that you'll find technically in the lexicons and stuff, in the Greek manuals. So
so there's the Amplified Classic, and then there's the other Amplified. Did you know there was two of them?
I didn't.
Well, that one says, not lording it over those assigned to your care. Do not be arrogant or overbearing, but be examples of Christian living to the flock. Set a pattern of integrity for your congregation. I think I like that.
Yeah, you could use that version and just preach out of it. I mean, honestly, you could preach from, if you had an Amplified Bible, you could take it in and you could have both versions there, and you could use the Amplified to be your message type stuff, because it really draws out a lot of the nuances.
So we're to set a pattern of integrity for our congregation.
Right. You're to be an example. You're to be an example. You're to become an example.
Everything's not gonna happen all at once, so
It doesn't.
you gotta keep it up.
Well, we're talking about you're going to have relational issues, you're going to have financial issues, you're going to have marital issues. You're going to have all kinds of situations that you're placed in that are going to be the proving ground for your ministry. And if you get uptight about one of those things and leave, here we go again. Let's go somewhere else. Okay, buddy, I'll have to give you the test somewhere else until you finally figure it out. You don't just leave every time you have a problem. You will have problems. You're naive if you don't believe that you will have problems. That's just burying your head in the sand like a ostrich. Is it an ostrich that does that?
It's life, right?
Huh?
In life we have problems.
Yeah, you're going to have problems in any church that you take at some point. But the more you prove yourself, it doesn't mean that you're not going to have any problems, but the better leader that you're going to be, you know. There's nothing especially easy about this, just because of all of these issues that we've talked about. For a pastor to show that he's worthy of his people emulating his life. I think it is, hang on a minute, just let me look it up. I think it is, don't go there. It's 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians, where Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, Paul said, imitate me just as I also imitate Christ. And so, you got to be a model. You just got to be a model for people to follow and to consider in their life. Not everybody is going to follow your leadership. You have to appreciate that. I think that this is one reason why so many men leave the ministry so early. They've not considered the emotional and the spiritual cost and the timeline that it takes to be a model. They just haven't figured that out. They think that this ought to happen quickly. That this is something that ought to take place quickly, and it can't. It cannot take place quickly. You don't grow quickly, young kids grow quickly, but this doesn't happen overnight. They want instant results, and that simply is not how God works. He's never in a hurry. There may be a fast food menu at some hamburger chain, but there is no fast development menu in God's program for us. It's not fast. It's never fast at all to become a godly leader. So, without overstating the issue, I want to say it this way, and I know that there would be people listening to this that ultimately, in different denominations, people that have really strong convictions about it, would disagree with me. That's okay. I can handle that. But leadership in a church is not hierarchical. It's not a triangle. It doesn't go to one person. If it goes to one person, you're in trouble. You're in trouble when leadership revolves around one dominant person that has a dominant personality, dominant speech, who's controlling in his mannerisms, who uses the pulpit as a wedge to get his way. That's hierarchical. You can't. That's not what you are actually looking for, because Jesus never intended. That's why the word elders is always used in the plural, with the exception of 1 or 2 times. It says here, I who am a fellow elder, and I think the other places where it's used is in 2 John. Let me just say, the elder, he writes that, and then he writes in 3 John chapter 1, the elder, that's the way he starts it off. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. And those may be the only 3 places where the word elder is used in the singular. Right? Every other place, I think it's used in the plural. So it's always a plurality. The leadership team has to be a plurality of godly men that are adjusting to the roles that they have in that church. So to have this kind of triangular hierarchical what we call it leadership model is about as dangerous of a model as you can have in a church. Because yes.
Can I give you an example of that? My father.
Sure.
Father-in-law.
Sure.
Sorry.
Sure.
My father-in-law is going to a Mennonite church,
Mm-hmm.
and several of the members have not been there, and he finally asked why. And it's because their hierarchy, the congregation wants a particular pastor in charge, but the hierarchy over their region, the guy that is the hierarchy wants his son in charge at that church. And it's creating big problems.
It probably should,
Yeah.
probably should.
I think it's his son-in-law. It's his son-in-law. He wants his
Either-
son-in-law.
Either way,
Yeah.
it probably should. It's just not God's model. I mean, I don't care how you argue it, it's just, good leadership in a church is composed of a good leadership team. It's a plurality of leaders, servant leaders.
It's like rowing a boat. I mean, if you got some rowing this way and then some not rowing at all, you're just gonna go in a circle.
Yeah, good luck. That's a good example. It's a good example. It's always a shared responsibility. It's always a plurality. And within that core of servant leaders, however many that you have, everybody has specific roles. Everybody should have specific roles that they play. Some of them, the role can be the same, but they still have specific roles. I know in my church, I'm considered the senior pastor, right? So I'm considered the senior teacher, pastor, teacher, whatever. But that doesn't mean that I am afraid to give over my teaching, to give over the pulpit to either you or to Chris, either one of you. I want you to teach, right? I want you to teach. I don't want to do it all. I'd rather have the church have different examples of other people teaching. I think that's healthy. And I just really believe that's healthy and good. So from the start, the goal is for the servant leader, we'll call it the pastor at this point, to become an example and a model for his church to replicate and follow in his life, in their life. To be a model that everybody can follow. All right? If you think about that in terms of that's what a leader is, you're in a lot better shape. You're going to be successful. You're going to be successful because you're not fighting for control under that purview. You're not controlling people under that purview. You're not demanding under that purview. You're just being an example of what it really means to be a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ. So you want to become an example and a model for your church to replicate and to follow. And that must be the way that you think. And I think that has to be the model. It has to be the picture that he places into his mind. This is the idea. This is the way I've said it. I wrote it down in a sentence. I am to be a model of authentic Christianity to my church. I am to be a model of authentic Christianity and humble leadership for this church. That's my calling. That's my calling. To be an authentic model of Christianity. And I think that before this kind of attitude, in my mind, having this kind of attitude is one of the most important decisions that any pastor has to make before he ever goes to a church. Before he ever goes there. Some pastors go with the idea that I'm going to become I want to be the leader. I want everybody to do what I want them to do. I'm going to push the programs that I think are going to push this church forward. Even some of the videos that we watch, James, I won't mention any names, on leadership. If you're not careful, they can push you in the wrong direction. You know, having so many, what's the right terms? So many rules, so many principles of leadership that it's just, it can just weigh you down. It can, I have to be careful as I listen to those, that I don't get weighed down by them. I just want to be a model. I want to treat my people with grace, with mercy. I want to be forgiving. I want to help. I want to stimulate, encourage, build up, not tear down. You know, those are really, really simple things. I want to love them when they fail. I want to support them when they fail. I want to support them when they struggle through different areas of their life, whatever it may be. And if you don't make that decision before you take a church, I think you're in trouble. You can just imagine the tremendous benefit that is derived when all of the members of a leadership team in a church have I want to call it a model mentality. A model mentality. It's just that all of us say, James, I'll include you in this, that we have the 4 elders, we have James, that we all are models. What an incredible privilege our church has to see 5 men with their families, loving their wives, loving God, loving their children, loving their grandchildren, being faithful to their church, studying the Word, just being an example of what it means to live out the Christian life. It's so foundational. It's just so remarkable in what it can do in a church. The problem that some churches have, especially in Baptist churches where they have deacons, they have a turnover rate every 2 to 3 years. Sometimes if you get elected, how do y'all do it in your church? How often do you elect them?
It's supposed to be.
So
it's supposed to be somebody rotates off every 3 years.
So you have a rotation. Let's just say you got 8 guys, and every 3 years, or every 4 years, 2 of them. Every year, 2 of them rotate off. Something like that.
So we have 5.
Okay.
So it kind of, but when there's no pool to
Draw
choose
from.
from, then you don't rotate off.
Okay, well that's even worse. All right, and then the reason I want to say that, I mean not for your benefit, but just is I don't see anything in the New Testament where the elders ever rotated off, unless they disqualified themselves. They were elders for life. That leadership team. So, and if it's deacons, and that's the leadership model, I think voting on them and changing them every 2-3 years is really, it becomes a popularity contest in a large church. You got 300, 400, 500, 2,000 people. Whoever's got the most money is going to have the most influence, and that's who's going to get elected. Or
Rather than the qualifications.
right. They don't look at the qualifications, huh?
Or the example.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it can be very dangerous.
Well, one of the things we have done is when we narrowed down the list, and so it's not that there aren't other guys, but it's made clear there's nobody qualified, so nobody gets rotated off.
Okay. It's been made clear that nobody.
Well, and then some of the guys, some of them who would be qualified are older
Mhm.
and don't
don't
want
want.
to. Yeah, so
Okay.
we do that. There is some of the people, but like we have people who've served as deacons before that I've made it clear that it's a hard and vote no, that I will vote for them to come back home because they rotated off as a deacon. I hadn't seen them.
Yeah. But you should. You should. They're not faithful. They're not a model, right?
No.
They're not a model. Nobody's going to be perfect, but they can be strong examples of what it means to live out the Christian life with love and care and dignity. And I think if you have the wrong model, that you have the wrong, you're setting yourself up for failure. That's just what I believe. I think the good models work, the bad models don't. The bad models have too many flaws in them. In the church, I want to mention this and then we'll close, take our 10-minute break, that you're going to, if you go to a small church, you're going to be underpaid and overworked, right? Just figure that out. You're going to be underpaid and overworked and probably underappreciated. But that does not negate the fact that you have to be the model. It doesn't negate it at all. You still have to be the model. In fact, that makes it even more apparent that you are a good model. If you're underpaid, overworked, and underappreciated, that you work through all of that without complaining about it. So. All right, this is I'm about halfway through page 6. If any of you, I've given you the rest of the notes, and I can't get. I'm gonna get finished tonight in 3 minutes. So, I've enjoyed this course. I hope you all have enjoyed it. I'm going to teach it another semester, and I just have other subjects that I want to teach on, and hopefully you'll join us for that. James, you want to close this, please?
Lord, we just pray as all of us men here in this room feel called to the ministry, we just pray that you would help us to take heed to 1 Peter 5:3, and that we would be continuous models, that you would enable us by your grace. We certainly cannot do it without your help. But we pray that you would help all of us, even our wives, to be continuous models, Lord, as pastors' wives, for your glory and for the church, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you.